I've learned this new thing that you can introduce people by the tweet count. So this is a 1.5 tweet introduction. You saw that yesterday morning. So Victor Hwang, co-founder, managing director, T2 Venture Capital, which builds startups and ecosystems. He's also the executive director of Global Innovation Summit, a very respected event. And more importantly, I really love this. If you're in the ecosystem business, he's the author of Rainforest, Building the Next Silicon Valley. So please help me in welcoming Victor.
Thank you, PK, and thanks to all of you. It's wonderful to be here at such a prestigious event like TiEcon, and I'm so glad you were able to eat your ice cream quickly enough to come inside here and join me. So I have an ambitious agenda here for this 15-minute talk, which is I want to transform the entire way you think about economic growth and business. Traditionally, we've looked at business in a particular way, and there's a lot of places around the world that are trying to design their own places like Silicon Valley. But what we want to do here today is to say, well, there's a different way to do this. And it fundamentally requires you to ask a different set of starting questions and to create a different set of answers as a result. And what it ultimately leads to is this idea that you make a difference in designing places like Silicon Valley, designing these types of ecosystems. Quickly, I want to do a little quiz on you. Just in your mind, think of one word that's the key to unlocking innovation. Keep it in your head. You don't need to say it out loud. But be honest. Remember what that word is. And at the end, we'll quiz you. We'll see how you thought and how it matched with what I'm talking about. Before I want to go into all the details of how you build places like Silicon Valley, a little bit about myself. I grew up as a child of Middle America. I don't look like it, but I grew up watching people like Walter Cronkite. Whereas a lot of people watch the news and they think about these things in an abstract way, this is very personal, because every day at dinner, my family would sit down and we would watch the news every single day at dinner time. And so I grew up as a young boy. Instead of thinking about playing football or baseball, I actually thought about the big questions. I thought, why are places like this? Why is there wealth? Why is there poverty? Why are some places thriving and other places languishing? And it's an unusual thing for a young kid to think about. But as I grew up, I wanted to get into government, and I wanted to study these things. And so I went to college, and I studied government and policy. And then as I moved beyond that, I realized, everything that they're talking about, how to stimulate growth, how to make the world more livable, how to increase quality of life, it doesn't match up with what I'm seeing. And so it disturbed me. And so I grew up wondering, well, surely there's got to be different ways to look at this problem. And so when I finally started to come up with a new way of looking at this problem, I realized that this was something I had to share to the world. And so last year I published a book called The Rainforest. On Monday, 2 days from now, we're launching a second book called The Rainforest Blueprint, which is a shorter, more colorful, lively version of the first book. And it's all about spreading this message about how do you design places like Silicon Valley? How do you create economic growth? How do you create wealth? How do you create better quality of life? So we're going to approach this from an unusual angle. This, some of you may or may not recognize, this is City Hall in Boston. And what's interesting about this building is it won a ton of awards. It was the height of modernist architecture, and people said this is a grand statement because it shows how brilliant human beings are. We can design such phenomenal, impressive structures that feature the best of human aspiration. But the problem with a building like this, and I went to college in Boston, is people don't like it. In fact, they hate it. It's an ugly thing. And the reason they don't like it is because it lacks scale. Human beings are like ants next to this thing. You are basically irrelevant when you consider yourself next to Boston City Hall. And that's what they intended. They intended to say, isn't what we've created in our government structures in our society so much more impressive than you as an individual? This same type of problem has been not just in architecture, but this is also the way we think of the way we run cities in urban design. So when they were looking at New York, when Robert Moses was planning where to put a freeway in New York, they created Riverside Drive, which goes from the south tip of Manhattan all the way to the northern side. And so if you're trying to move goods efficiently, if you're planning a master structure for Manhattan, of course you would create a road to move stuff efficiently from south to north or north to south. You'd slam a road all the way along that coastline because it's the best place to put it to move stuff around. But what's the problem with East Riverside Drive? Well, it's pretty ugly. There's no beachfront. There's nothing there. You think of all the great beachfronts around the world, and Manhattan doesn't have it on this side because they put this highway through the whole thing. Again, it lacks human scale. It says that we're so much more impressive at making mass-scale decisions for an entire society, and your enjoyment of the beach, that's not as important as what we're trying to do with the whole system. And so this is interesting because it creates there's a shift in thinking over the years. And this shift has been what we call design thinking. Whereas in the beginning we thought of objects like this little clicker here. This is industrial design, how you make this object, the way you lay out the shapes, the colors, the way it feels in the hand. It's all meant to be efficient, to make it more productive and useful. And then we look at buildings and it's architectural design, which is a shift away from modernist architecture to architecture that feels more warm, useful, productive. And we do this in cities as well. Urban design was this movement away from top-down planning of cities to look at, well, how do you design cities so that human beings can live in them more comfortably and live better lives and more fruitful lives? The next shift in this, I believe, is the shift towards entire economies. And this is what we call ecosystem design, which is, can you design an entire economy, an entire economic system, the same way you might try to change the way you look at buildings or cities? So that's what this is really about. When we talk about how do you design a Silicon Valley, we really mean how do you design it? How do you think about it and what makes it go? In fact, can we reinvent the entire role of you in the new economy? Can we change the whole way we think about economic development and growth and business so that it incorporates the individual? The world is really looking for this framework. So if you go back to the history of economic thinking, what we're talking about is actually fundamentally different from what people have thought about economics before. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote this little book, and this book started what's known as classical economics. And classical economics is based on this idea that land, labor, and capital are what matter. 1871, you had a movement that started which people later called Neoclassical Economics. And Neoclassical Economics says that, well, supply and demand matter. It's these things in equilibrium. In 1990, people started saying, Michael Porter at Harvard, as well as others, started to say, well, clusters. The way you put people next to each other. And if you put them next to each other, that creates the kind of growth and relationships you need to thrive. But fast forward now to 2013, and what do we see? Well, all these things don't seem to explain the world we live in today. You have countries, you have cities all over the world that they've created clusters, they've added all sorts of resources, and they still lack in growth. They still don't see the kind of quality of life you'd think of. You think of cities in the United States where they aren't Silicon Valley, despite having great universities, lots of money, talented people, people who work hard, they still don't have the same thing. So we need a new framework because all the answers that we've been given don't seem to answer the problem. When we look at what we think of economics today, it's like this. This is the industrial model of economics, and it's basically what we still do today, which is assembly of resources. How efficiently can you put things together so that you can buy them, so they're cheaper coming in, and you sell them more going out? How do you increase value by the way you put things together? An assembly line is a great example of it. And if you fast forward to the modern era, it's basically exactly the same. It's instead of an assembly line of old things, this is Foxconn in China today. They're assembly lines for making modern stuff. And if you think of information technology, it's the same model. We think of codes, a number of lines being programmed. We think of hours being sat at desks. This model of industrial era economics is still very much fixed in our thinking because it's very useful. It's very useful for how we make things in productive ways. But what we're talking about when we look at places like Silicon Valley is a new model. It's a new paradigm for innovation. So instead of looking at plantations, we're looking at rainforests. So the old model is about a plantation. If you think of a plantation or a farm, what are you trying to do? You know what crop you want to grow, and you try to create the best parameters to grow the most of that crop with the fewest, most efficient resources possible. And so you think of large companies that are making lots of stuff in mass production. These are farms. And if there's a weed that pops up on your farm, if a product shows up the way you didn't plan for it, what do? Well, you kill the weed. You get rid of it because that's not what you want. So what you're looking to do on plantations is to find stuff that you can predict. And you can do it in very, very measurable, predictable ways. In rainforests, on the other hand, the weeds are the most interesting things. If you think of a company like Facebook, 8 years ago, what was Facebook? Was that a planned crop or was it a weed? It was totally a weed, right? You've seen the movie, The Social Network, where Larry Summers, one of the smartest men in the world, is telling Mark Zuckerberg, forget it, kid, just finish your college degree. So these things you can't predict, no matter how smart you are. So something about randomness and the weeds instead of the crops are what's interesting about rainforests. And so we have this very interesting paradox, which is that while plants are harvested most efficiently on farms, weeds sprout best in rainforests. And a very good example of this is embedded in this little iPhone right here. The making of this at Foxconn is on plantation. You don't want too much you don't want variability in these things, right? When you buy an iPhone off the shelf, you want it to turn on exactly like all the other iPhones. But the design of this process, of this, like the thinking that goes into the next generation phone, or how to make this thing more user-friendly, when you sit down at a table in a small design team, and there's stories of Steve Jobs sitting down in his design teams, planning the next iteration of the phone or the next device. They didn't know what they were going to come up with when they sat down. Right? There was a built-in process that they designed to come up with stuff that was unpredictable. So these weeds have rainforests. They have in certain types of environments where you generate stuff that's not predictable, instead of the stuff that's predictable, like we normally think of in the industrial model. And these rainforests nurture these serendipitous interactions between all sorts of players throughout a system. So it's not just the raw assets you put in, it's everything. It's not just the money, but it's the way the money interacts with the talent, the way it interacts with the news and media outlets, the global supply chains, and the culture. There's all these elements of ecosystems that cause this kind of reaction. And this requires a radical shift in perspective from what we're used to thinking. Economic systems are usually about land, labor, and capital, and arguably technology going into this factory we call an economic system. And out comes output. But the real world, we know, is not run by gears, it's run by human beings. And human beings are the ones that control these resources. The land, labor, and capital, and technology have people that deal with them. So it's something about the way these people interact that causes that output. And real human beings are separated, just like we are here in this room today. We can be right next to each other, but there's all sorts of things that separate us. Not just if we can overcome geography by sitting in the same room, we're still separated by culture, by language, by social networks, and by lack of trust. We just don't know each other. So these types of barriers are huge. These are the invisible barriers that are always there. In fact, these are the invisible barriers that permeate all of human society. And this happens across the entire world. Fundamentally, if you think about all the stuff you know in your head, and all the stuff you could share with everybody around you, and how little of it makes it out of your head into the minds of others, these barriers dominate our world. So the secret of rainforests, the secret of places like Silicon Valley, is this, which is that economies thrive when culture overcomes social barriers and fosters connectivity, trust, and collaboration between highly diverse people. That's really at the heart of Silicon Valley. And it's unusual because this stuff sounds very fuzzy. And if you talk to economists, they'll tell you, well, that doesn't explain, fuzzy stuff like that doesn't explain economic growth. But it does. Because at the heart of it, it says something different, which is it says it's not the system that matters in top-down decision-making, it's you that matter. You at the bottom level of this whole system, you actually drive the creation of the system. The micro affects the macro because it affects everybody in this network. And if you look at Silicon Valley, you can find these sets of behaviors embedded into a social contract. It's like an unwritten constitution. And we call these the rules of the rainforest. These are embedded everywhere, and they're very much similar to the TiE social contract that people adopt when they join TiE as a member. You break rules and dream. You think big. You open doors and listen. You hear people that are different from you. You trust and be trusted. You give it first. You don't reciprocate an eye for an eye. You actually give people and expect things will happen. You experiment and iterate together. You try stuff out. You seek fairness, not advantage. You don't try to win against everybody. In zero-sum games, you try to create positive-sum games. You err, fail, and persist. It's okay to make mistakes and fail. And you pay it forward. You keep giving into the system. And when you do it that way, what happens? It becomes a form of free-flowing currency. So instead of a barter economy, you actually have a currency that flows of favors. And when you have favors flowing in a system, it changes everything because suddenly the system is unlocked. So I mentioned this book, which came out last year, The Rainforest. And what's happened in the past year is we've been doing this all over the world. We've been helping people trying to build these rainforests. We give tools. Some people ask us to come in to help. We talk about it. But mostly it's about them. It's about people trying to build these systems themselves and doing it in a disciplined, thoughtful, pragmatic way. This is the book coming out in 2 days, The Rainforest Blueprint. And this is for those folks who don't want to read a 300-page book on the left. On the right is a 66-page, full-color, breezy book that feels like you're watching a movie. So that'll be out very soon. And this is the work we've been doing. You can see some of these sessions. We actually take these practical tools of how you design these elements, these social contracts, these measurement systems, to try to see how can you unlock this type of cultural behavior in a community. So there are 3 words. They're not just one word for how you unlock these innovation ecosystems. I'd ask you to think of a word at the very beginning. So I'll give you the 3. So one is fear. So fear, the fear that people have of trying stuff or talking to the person next to you or giving information out. This is a major issue. And the opposite of fear is trust. Trust is what lets you overcome fear, right? It's the opposite. When you trust people, you share information, you experiment, you try new things out, you build companies with them. And then trust is tied to love. Right? Love, the ability to take a chance with someone, no matter what, because you just love them. That changes everything, if everybody has that in their minds. So rainforests ultimately thrive by nurturing what makes us uniquely human, as opposed to this traditional economic thinking, this industrialist thinking, which is that, well, it's the stuff that's ahuman that matters. What we're saying is there's a new way of thinking of economic value, which is that it's about making us even more human. It's about the stuff that makes us happy, the stuff that gives us joy. You cannot start a company unless you love this stuff, right? It's just too hard. You need to be happy when you do these things in a deep, deep, satisfying way. It's about the stuff that makes you sad, because if you can't overcome these heartbreaks and you don't enjoy the big roller coaster ride of building new innovative products and things and solutions, then you won't do it either. You have to be willing to handle this stuff. And it's about love. It's about the willingness it takes to bond with someone else and create something together that allows you to build bigger, bigger structures. Every large organization, every large company is essentially bonds of two people. It's about how these two people interact, whether they're sitting in a coffee shop or at a conference like this one, and how it's spread across millions of times across an entire system. You can build an entire system by looking at the constructs of two people at a time. And so we go back to New York again. I started this conversation about New York, and I'll end it with New York, which is they actually tried, Robert Moses tried to build a highway to connect the east and the west sides of Manhattan. And he wanted to take it through Greenwich Village. He was about to destroy Greenwich Village to build a highway to move goods around efficiently. And there was a movement in the late 60s led by Jane Jacobs and others that said, you know, that's not it at all. This is the stuff that matters. In places like Greenwich Village, it's the interactions of people. It's the street life. It's what people do. And this is where the value comes from. Economic value comes from the transactions of individuals. And the richness of those interactions are what cause the system to flourish as a whole. So silly things like trust and dreams and love, they're not just fuzzy concepts. They actually power the world. So I welcome you to join us in this journey as we're trying to build rainforests all over the world. I thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you, PK.
Thank you, Victor, for that very exciting introduction to the rainforest. I had a chance to go through the book, very exciting. So as you know, we keep this stacked very quick order. So let me just ask Sasha Johnson, and again, we're going to do one tweet introduction, Managing Director of DFJ VTB Aurora, which specializes in investments in Russia and Commonwealth of Independent States. And if you want to make friends with Sasha, cabbage pie, ping pong, basketball.